Welcome back. While February is Black History Month, and I think it's extremely important to read diverse books all year round, I wanted to shout out 10 of my all-time favorite books by Black authors. The first book is All the Fighting Parts by Hannah V. Sawyer. So I was following this author all the way to her road to publication, and this was one of my most anticipated debut releases for 2023. And let me tell you, it did not disappoint. The story is about Amina, who is a young Black girl who experiences a sexual assault from a trusted member of her church clergy. This book is told in verse. And it also uses some clever writing techniques that include like court transcripts, police transcripts and interviews, newspaper clippings, and that kind of thing as well. So I really loved the brilliant way that this author constructed or structured this novel, but then the story just really hits very deep on a lot of heavier topics as well. And I think what makes this book even more special is that Hannah V. Sawyer, the author, she wrote this book inspired by her own life events. So it's not autobiography, but it is inspired from her own life events. And I think that just adds a lot of power to this story. So this is one that I read last year, and I absolutely adored it. Highly recommend this book. And if you do the audiobook, I believe Hannah narrates it herself. The next book I recommend is Legendborn by Tracy Dion. So this is the first book in a part of a series. It is a young adult fantasy series. I kind of want to say it's contemporary fantasy because it's set in today's world, but has the fantasy elements in it. I love this one, and it was a bit of a surprise to me because it's kind of a King Arthur retelling, and I've never been a huge fan of King Arthur stories, so this was a little out of the box for me, but I devoured it. It was so good. So you start off with the main character, Bree, and she has just lost her mother, and the story digs a lot into grief and how she deals with her grief. And she ends up going to a college it's a program for high schoolers at this college, Chapel Hill in North Carolina. And it's a program for seniors, and she decides to go to it because that was her mother's alma mater, even though her dad suggests that she doesn't and doesn't necessarily want her to go, but she feels it's important for her in her process of grief to go to this college. Once she gets there, she learns that there's a lot more going on than what she thought there was. And this is when the fantasy elements start to come in, and we realize that King Arthur and all of his men of the Round Table, there is a secret society at the school of their scions, their descendants, and they are protecting from this magical occurrences that are happening at the school and putting people at the school at risk. So I loved the setting of it being Chapel Hill. I think that added a lot to it. And then just all of the different characters and the relationship development was so great in this one. I loved it. Next up is Nothing Burns as Bright as You by Ashley Woodfolk. This book is a story told in verse. It is another young adult. Young adult and young adult fantasy is my favorite genre, so that is what I read the most of. But this one is all the teenage angst and love and emotions that you want in a book. I love that it was told in verse. It focuses on a female-female relationship, and it's a friendship that turns into love. It's one of those where the two people together are kind of like, flame and water, and just they clash, but yet you root for them and you want them to be together, but you also at the same time know that they're terrible for each other. And it's just this range of emotion. So if you want to reminisce on those young teen toxic relationships, but feeling all of the feels, all of the good and all of the bad, and just that emotional roller coaster, this book really does that. I loved it. Up next is a book by Nick Stone called Fast Pitch. So I've read almost every book that Nick Stone has put out. This one in particular is her middle grade novel. And if you were a fan of The Sandlot growing up, like I was, this book is it. It is a female version of The Sandlot and focuses on an all-Black softball team in Georgia that are competing for a championship. And it's fantastic. One of my nieces plays softball softball pretty competitively, and I'm telling you, the dialogue and the banter between the teammates and the players just reminded me so much of my niece. It felt so authentic to the softball world and was just so cute. It also touches on, because it is a team in the South, it touches on racial issues, and there's also some flashbacks to the main character's, I think it was her uncle or possibly her father, but one of her relatives was trying to be a professional ball player as well. So we get some some family history in here to add depth to the overall story. This was a very quick read, but I highly recommend it for middle grade or adult. I thoroughly enjoyed this one. Up next is This Poison Heart by Kaylin Bayron. This was my first book by this author, but a lot of friends love her series and had recommended her. So this is a young adult fantasy book as well. And what I loved about this one is that there was some adoption rep in it. So I adopted both of my sons. So I love seeing adopted characters in books and adopted families in books. So the main character, she lives in New York, and her two moms who adopted her, they own like a floral company. And what we realize is that our main character has a special affinity for plants. When plants are around her, they just respond to her. They lean in, or they grow, or if she gets angry, the plants get angry and react too. So her emotions are directly tied to her magic around plants and living things, which her moms don't really know what to do with this. They live in our modern day world where magic isn't really a thing. So it's kind of this family secret that they keep, that their daughter can control plants that way, which they live in, the concrete jungle of New York. So there's not as many plants around them as you would think. So it's easier for her to try to hide her ability. But this story particularly kicks off whenever she has a biological family member, I think it was an aunt, who passes away and leaves her an estate in upstate New York. And she doesn't really know anything about her biological family. So this is a moment of intrigue for her and for her adoptive moms. And they decide to go up to this country estate and see what it is that she was left in this will. And things they really kind of take off from there. So she gets there, and now she's in this country area. She's surrounded by nature, and her powers start to bloom. And then she begins to realize that there's a lot more to her biological family who maybe also had some of these magical powers as well. So it's a really fun story. I also like that we just get so much of the family dynamics along with the magic and the action as well. So this is a duology, and this is the first book in the series that I adored. This next book may be familiar to several of you because it is a Netflix movie now, which is called The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. I love Angie Thomas and will read any book that she writes. I adore her way of storytelling and character building, and then she always hits you deep with her messages in her books. So this story is about a girl named Star who is the witness of her best friend's death whenever they are pulled over one night by a white police officer, and when her friend goes to reach for his hairbrush, he is shot and killed by the police officer. So this is a heavier read. It's all about Star and how she's coping with this death and how she's trying to find justice for her friend and also dealing with being the witness of this murder. So this one, fantastic. I did enjoy the movie adaptation, but the book is better. The book is so much better. So if you watch the movie, you should read the book. And if you haven't done either, then you should definitely read this book because it is extremely powerful and will just have you thinking about a lot of things. And I think that it can be very educational to some people as well. So this is one that I tend to always recommend if I have a random friend that knows that I read a lot, but they're not readers themselves. They're like, what's one book you tell everyone to read? This is usually the one that I go to. The next book I have is actually in the adult genre. I know, we're switching up the young adult here a little bit. So this is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. I read this as a buddy read with one of my best friends, and Wow, let me just say, this book is crazy and it is so good. It's a trilogy, and we binged all 3 books back to back because you can't stop once you get into this story. I will say this one has very intricate world building, and being a fantasy novel with intricate world building, it requires your attention. This is not a passive read. You have to be focused and ready for it, but the payout is so worth it. I'm just telling you, I'm just thinking about scenes right now, and this book blew my mind. It is one of my all-time favorite series, and N.K. Jemisin secured a spot as one of my top authors of all time because this series is so brilliant. So it is multi-POV, and it starts off, we are in this, I guess, futuristic world. I don't really know if it was futuristic or just a different world, but we start off in a world where catastrophes are happening pretty regularly, such as earthquakes or flooding or fires or tornadoes. And so you have these different seasons of catastrophes. And then across the world, you have little communities that are set up, and those communities are kind of like almost like doomsday prepper communities. Everybody has a role, whether or not you're a gatherer or you're a worker or you're even a breeder to continue on the race, etc. So you have these isolated communities that are designed to withstand catastrophes. But we start off and we are at one of the catastrophes that are predicted to end the world, the 5th season. And it opens up with a mother who has lost her daughter, and she is bound to do anything she can to go find this daughter. So it's really hard to go into more detail with this because it is so layered and so deep. But I highly recommend it, especially if you like fantasy or adult fantasy and you like intricate world building. This one is amazing and will blow your mind. All right, back to young adult. This is another novel that is told in verse, The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. This book was a random pickup for me one summer. I was wanting something light and fun. All I knew about it was that it focused on a boy that was into drag, and I was here for that. So this story follows a teenage boy as I can't remember if he was in high school, if he was in his first year of college, but he's around that 18, 19 years old age. I feel like it might have been his first year of college. But he gets his first boyfriend back at home, and then he has to go off to college and be separated from his boyfriend for a time being. But this is when it's really a coming of age story. And we go through the main character discovering who he is and who he wants to be in relationships, and discovering his own identity and his own self and his own confidence in his self. And that's whenever he finds his drag community and discovers what drag is for him. So this was just a sweet, emotional read, coming of age story, and one that I loved. I did the audiobook on this one, and Dean Atta narrates it himself, which is fantastic because the main character has mixed nationality. He was, I believe, British and Jamaican, and I remember listening to the audio thinking, wow, this narrator really has nailed both accents, and it was kind of shocking to me that he was able to nail both of those accents so authentically. And so that's what made me look up to see who's narrating the book, and realized it was the author. And the author shares that same nationality, that same mixed nationality, and that totally made sense. So I highly recommend doing the audio on this one. I had to buy the book once I read it, and I'm going to show you too the underneath the jacket how cute that design is. So anyways, I love this book. I would reread it. So good. This next book is another young adult, and it is Allegedly by Tiffany D. Jackson. If you've ever read a Tiffany D. Jackson book, you know that she comes in hard with heavy topics and really challenges her readers with the stories. A lot of her books are based off of real life inspiration, such as real life big court cases that perhaps garnered a lot of attention. So you'll see if any of this kind of feels like a story you've heard before. But she takes those stories and she writes books about them that, again, are just challenging to the reader and brilliant. She is a genius at what she does. I will read any book by her, but I am prepared to feel an array of emotions as I do so. So this book, Allegedly, is about a teenage girl who, when she was 9 years old, she was convicted for murdering a white infant that was in the care of her mother. So the main character's mother was a church-going woman, and she babysat this wealthy white child. And the the child died while she was in her care, and it was determined that allegedly the 9-year-old daughter was the one who killed the baby and who is now, in the court system because of that act. So we pick up as the main character is a teenager, and we learn that she is pregnant, and she is trying to, I don't know if necessarily trying to exonerate her name, but she is trying to not lose custody of the baby that she's about to birth. And so it's revisiting the case and what happened with the story, because the main character is wanting a life for herself, but because of this conviction of her being a part of the murder of this infant, she's at risk of losing her baby as soon as it's born. And so she's trying to do everything she can not to. So this book, and none of that's spoilery, that's all on the blurb of this book, but what this story explores is, did she do it? Did she not do it? What actually happened that night? And how can we move forward from such a tragedy that was, and what all things were at play there? So this is emotionally gripping. It will have you, it'll have your jaw on the floor. I'll just say that. It'll have your jaw on the floor. But there are triggers, as you can imagine, with the content of that story. So if you do have triggers, check that before reading this one. But I highly recommend Tiffany D. Jackson. Her books are fantastic. And last but not least, I kind of cheated on this one because Blackout is an anthology written by a bunch of my favorite authors, including Tiffany D. Jackson, Nick Stone, Angie Thomas, Ashley Woodfolk, all who were featured in the stack. And then a couple more that I love as well, Danielle Clayton and Nicola Legune. So all of these authors are friends in real life, and they decided to put together an anthology that's about love stories, and specifically Black love stories, all set around a central event. So this book is so adorable. It is short. It is a quick read, and it is set during a blackout in New York City. I love books set in New York City. New York City is one of my favorite cities. I just think there are so many stories to be told there, and I just love that backdrop. So we are in a citywide blackout in New York, and each story follows along different teens, their love stories, essentially. You'll have one group of teens that have just broke up, and they're having to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge together, even though they had just recently broken up. Or you'll have some friends to lovers situations, but each author picked a different trope in fantasy, and they wrote that trope in there. And what I love about this anthology specifically is that while each story is its own story, they do link together, and you see cameos of each individual story as the book goes on. So it just weaves together in a very flawless way. So this one was very visual for me, and it was adorable. I loved the variety of romance and the variety of characters, and how all these different things are happening in New York City simultaneously. So those are just a few of my favorite Black authors. And if you're looking for books to diversify yourself or to read more, these are ones that I recommend and I love. So let me know in the comments which books you're reading this month, and if you've read any of these or if you have any more to recommend to me. I'd love to know. What do you think?